Dorian Gray hangs a portrait in an attic. Every passing year, every act of cruelty, every moral compromise appears on its surface while the man himself remains untouched. He visits it in secret across decades, watching it become the only honest record of his life. That image has defined more than a century of adaptations, each treating the portrait as a supernatural engine of the story. Oscar Wilde had something more unsettling in mind. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a diagnosis of what happens when a man mistakes an aesthetic philosophy for an ethical one. The portrait records with perfect accuracy, yet it never tells Dorian what to do with what it reveals. To understand why, we have to start at the beginning. The 1945 film with Hurd Hatfield used a color sequence for the portrait's corrupted face, the only color in an otherwise black and white film, making the horror of the transformation literally luminous against everything else on screen. The effect is striking, and it performs the cursed object reading with precision. The portrait as a supernatural engine of the story, its revelation a horror movie moment of unveiled darkness. The 2009 film with Ben Barnes made the Faustian bargain explicit from the first reel, casting Dorian as a man knowingly trading his soul for immortality. Lord Henry's role in the 2009 version is reduced to a tempter, with Colin Firth delivering aphorisms as seduction, their philosophical weight left behind, and Dorian's fate is sealed early. The rest of the film is the inevitable working out of the deal already made. This is the narrative logic the cursed portrait reading generates. The wish is the hinge, and everything after is consequence. Television adaptations, stage versions, graphic novel treatments, the multiple literary retellings, each one centers the portrait's transformation as a visual and dramatic core. The gap between Dorian's unchanging face and the canvas's accumulating horror is where the genre energy lives. The actors who have played Dorian treat the portrait scenes as the performance's peak, the moment of confrontation with a supernatural record. What is left out from most versions is Lord Henry's philosophy. The aphorisms appear, usually one or two of the most famous ones, but function as character flourishes, the doctrine that makes the novel's argument left behind. Lord Henry in Adaptation is a witty, dangerous catalyst. In the novel, he is the source of a complete philosophical system that Dorian attempts to inhabit. The whole novel is really about what happens when somebody actually tries to live inside such a system. That is a different story from a man making a supernatural wish, and it is much harder to film. Subscribe to keep up with the series. Channel memberships are open, members get early access, exclusive essays, and a backlog of 100+ older videos. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Be always searching for new sensations. The aim of life is self-development. Live the wonderful life that is in you. These statements are persuasive in exactly the proportion that they are untestable in the abstract. Lord Henry's aphorisms function as philosophy, and they produce, in practice, a complete ethical system built entirely from aesthetic principles. Here is what that system is. Beauty is the measure of value. Experience is its own justification. Age and damage and guilt are enemies of the good life because they're aesthetically offensive. They mark and degrade and compromise the beautiful. Conscience is what average people use to manage their mediocrity. The exceptional man lives by aesthetic standard alone. He cultivates sensation, avoids diminishment, and treats others as aesthetic objects, interesting or dull, beautiful or common, worth collecting or worth discarding. In practice, this is a fully articulated framework for how to live, derived entirely from aesthetic principles. Lord Henry believes it, but he has never had to live it at any consequential scale. He delivers the doctrine from the position of a man who can afford to theorize it. Dorian practices it, and the novel is about what the practice produces. Dorian absorbs the doctrine at 18 and builds his life around it. The wish, the moment he looks at Basil's portrait and says aloud that he would give his soul for the painting age in his place, is a theatrical expression of the decision Lord Henry has already taught him to make. He has decided he will not carry the weight of what he does. It's the framework taken to its logical conclusion. If beauty is paramount, preserve it. If consequence degrades, store it somewhere else. Let's return back to the portrait's actual function, because this is where the novel's argument lives. The portrait records. That is its only function. Every cruelty Dorian performs, every betrayal, every act of casual devastation leaves a mark on the canvas. The face in the painting acquires lines, then cruelty around the eyes, then a particular hardness in the mouth, Then something worse, the accumulating physical evidence of the life Dorian is living. The portrait is an accurate document, and its horror is the truth it shows. Dorian locks it in the attic. Sibyl Vane, the actress Dorian claims to love, gives up her art for him, stopping her performances with the transcendence she had before, because real emotion has replaced the distance that made her acting extraordinary. Dorian, confronted with a woman who is now fully present, her aesthetic perfection gone, abandons her with a cruelty he delivers like a verdict. She dies that night. Dorian grieves for approximately 1 evening before Lord Henry redirects him towards a new experience. The portrait records the moment of abandonment. Dorian returns downstairs. Alan Campbell, a former friend, is blackmailed into disposing of a body for Dorian and kills himself afterward. James Vane spends 17 years hunting Dorian for his sister's death and is killed by accident during a hunting party, a consequence that arrives with the randomness that only fate can hold, carrying none of the weight of design, which is how consequences tend to arrive for people who have spent years insulating themselves from them. The people who enter Dorian's orbit and are destroyed by him accumulate. The portrait records each of them. The attic door remains locked. Wilde's target sits deeper than supernatural evil. He was writing against aestheticism specifically, the version of it that used beauty as a philosophical license for moral vacancy. It's the doctrine of art for art's sake, taken to its logical conclusion, producing a man who experiences other people as aesthetic objects. Lord Henry is just the theorist of this position, but Dorian, he's the practitioner, and the novel is the practitioner's account. Dorian Gray was published in 1890 in Lippincott's monthly magazine and immediately provoked accusations of immorality severe enough that Wilde revised and expanded it for the 1891 book edition, adding several chapters and a preface. The preface, in particular, is famous for the line, "All art is quite useless," a deliberate provocation that frames the novel as purely aesthetic, its moral content left unstated. Perhaps needless to say, that framing is just a defense. The novel is the most precisely moral thing Wilde ever wrote. However, the preface created a reception problem. Wilde was presenting the novel as art that refused morality at the same moment the novel was making a precise moral argument. Readers and critics faced with that contradiction took the preface's frame, "This is an aesthetic object, not a moral document," and applied it to the novel's supernatural machinery. The portrait became the aesthetic centerpiece, the cursed object that generated the visual drama, and the moral argument retreated behind Wilde's defense, his own insistence that no such argument ever really existed. Then, what the 1895 trials did to the novel's reception was decisive. After Wilde's conviction for gross indecency, Dorian Gray was retroactively read as confession, as self-portrait, maybe as autobiography, the document of a man who had spent his life doing what Dorian does. The novel then became about Wilde. The specific philosophical failure he was diagnosing was pushed to the margins. The man on trial replaced the argument in the text, and the supernatural horror of the portrait supplied the drama in place of the philosophical one. These two substitutions have organized the novel's reception ever since. Lord Henry's Doctrine outlives its Victorian setting. It is available in every era in which beauty, social capital, and platform are sufficient insulation against consequence. A philosophy of self-cultivation organized entirely around experience and sensation, with aesthetic value as its only standard, makes the most sense to a person who has never been required to face a consequence. When consequence is reliably avoided by wealth, position, or fame, the framework functions perfectly. It's only when the record accumulates to the point of unbearability that its absence of any course correction mechanism becomes visible. We have watched people inhabit Lord Henry's Doctrine in every decade since Wilde wrote it. The person who treats others as aesthetic objects worth collecting or discarding. The person for whom experience is his own justification and conscience is the language of lesser people. The person who has, somewhere, a portrait. The portrait is not always a painting. Sometimes it is a paper trail, a set of messages, a group of people who know what the public face does not show. The logic is identical, and the ending tends to follow the same trajectory, given time. What the novel carries is a preface insisting it has no moral, wrapped around one of the most precise moral arguments in Victorian fiction. Lord Henry teaches the doctrine, Dorian demonstrates what it produces across decades, and Basil, who loves Dorian clearly and honestly and fears what Lord Henry will do to him, is the first person Dorian destroys, murdered for exactly that clarity. The novel is a precise account of what happens when a philosophy built on beauty and the avoidance of consequence meets an accurate record of the life it produced, and when the person who built the arrangement tries to destroy the record without ever reckoning with it. The portrait is accurate. That is all it ever was. The horror is in the accuracy, in the decades of refusing to carry it, and the knife that ends both the record and the man who could not separate himself from what it contained. The last episode examined Jekyll and Hyde and the question of what a system of required virtue produces, how the code that demands a unified face builds the conditions for specific deviance it most abhors. That episode is linked here. Subscribe to keep up with the series, thanks for watching, and stay copacetic.